Someone was supposed to be helping that night, someone she trusted. Someone who showed up at her apartment on a Thursday evening in October to watch the children while she worked. He was the father of two of them. They'd had a relationship once. Now, they had an arrangement the kind millions of couples navigate every day. Co-parenting, shared responsibility. A routine that had become the architecture of their separate lives. But somewhere between the moment he arrived and the moment he left, something shifted in the geography of that apartment. And what seemed ordinary on the surface was actually a trap being set in the darkness outside. It started, like many of these stories do, with a person who couldn't accept that a relationship had ended. According to investigators in Orange County, California, Humberto Rodriguez Martinez had been jealous. Not the quiet kind of jealousy that sits in the background of your life. The kind that translates into watching, waiting, planning. His ex-girlfriend had moved on. She was dating someone new. A man named Daniel Reyes, 32 years old, from Los Angeles. And she'd integrated him into her life, in the way people do when they think a relationship might become something permanent. She brought him around. He spent time at the apartment. He was becoming part of the home where her children lived. For Rodriguez Martinez, this was unbearable. Not because he wanted her back. Investigators never found evidence of that. It was about control. It was about a world that had changed in ways he could no longer influence. Research shows that when a relationship ends but people remain connected through shared children, the stress can be complicated. The loss is real, but so is the ongoing contact. And when a new partner enters the space, when they become proximate to the children, to the routines, to the life that was once shared, something in the former partner can fracture. So on October 17, 2017, Rodriguez Martinez did what he did every so often. He went to the apartment to watch his children. He was still allowed to do that. He still had that access. And in this case, he didn't go alone. He brought a friend, Aiden Zapitleva. Another man, another set of hands to help with the kids. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise alarm. The children's mother left for work. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? This was their arrangement. This was normal. But here's where the story becomes something else entirely. He didn't actually leave when she expected. According to his co-defendants, later confession that didn't come until 2023. 6 years after that night, the two men never went anywhere at all. They stayed close to the building. They watched the apartment. They waited. Investigators would later learn that they had surveilled the location for hours, knowing that Daniel Reyes was inside with the woman they were focused on. And when she called to ask where they were, when she wanted to know if they'd actually left the area, one of them told her a lie. A deliberate lie. They told her again. They'd been gone for hours. There was nothing to worry about. The coast was clear. Everything was fine. It was the kind of lie that only works if you have built up enough trust to be believed without hesitation. Years of co-parenting, years of showing up, years of being the father to his children had created a foundation of trust that he was now using for something else entirely. Think about what that means. The person you trusted with your children, the person you'd arranged your work schedule around, the person whose presence in your home had become routine. He was, in that moment, actively deceiving you so that someone else would feel safe enough to leave the building. So Daniel Reyes Anaheim, unaware of the surveillance, unaware of the conversation happening in the darkness, beyond the apartment walls, eventually left. It was early morning by then, October 19th, almost 5 in the morning. And somewhere between the apartment and the street corner 2 blocks away, he encountered 2 men. By the time police arrived, it was over. Reyes was dead. He'd been stabbed 10 times. And in his final moments, according to the record that would emerge later, he'd begged for his life. He'd said something to his attackers that most of us would say in that situation. Something that invokes the only leverage a person has when they're about to die. "Please don't," he said. "I have children." It was a reminder of his own humanity, his own dependence, his own mortality in the face of something he couldn't have predicted. It didn't matter. The attack had been planned. And plans don't stop because someone mentions their children. One of the men ran. Within days, his car was found abandoned in San Diego, near the border. He was gone. He had access to somewhere resources, people, infrastructure that allowed him to flee south, across a line into Mexico, and then to disappear for years. The other man was arrested 2 days later. He didn't resist. He didn't run. Maybe he thought it was over faster than he expected. Maybe he thought coming forward quickly would count for something. Or maybe he understood that fleeing wasn't an option for him, the way it might have seemed to be for his accomplice. Years passed. The first man stayed away. He remained a name on a multi-million-dollar warrant. Law enforcement agencies into countries looked for him. He lived somewhere, existed somewhere, knowing that what he'd allegedly done was waiting for him like a debt that never expires. And then something changed. Mexican authorities eventually found him. Working with United States agencies, they arranged for his return. On December 4th, 2025, more than 8 years after that, Humberto Rodriguez Martinez was extradited to Los Angeles and taken into custody at the airport by homicide detectives from the Anaheim Police Department. Days later, he appeared in court in Orange County. He entered a plea of not guilty to the charges. He's being held without bail. The case is in pretrial status, waiting for trial. But the question that lingers underneath all of this is the one that the legal system isn't built to answer. What do those years mean? Years of being a fugitive. Years of not being home, not seeing his children, living under the weight of what he'd allegedly done. Was he running from justice? Was he running from himself? And is there actually a difference? This is the strange architecture of a love triangle that became a murder, and then became a mystery of time and distance, and what happens when someone decides that losing control is worth losing everything. So let's step back. Let's understand what had happened in the months before that October night. Humberto Rodriguez Martinez and his ex-girlfriend had ended their relationship sometime in 2017. It wasn't recent. It was months before October. But the ending wasn't the kind where people simply stop seeing each other. They had 2 children together, shared custody, scheduled visitation, all the infrastructure that keeps former partners tethered to each other long after the romantic part has dissolved. Psychologists recognize that this situation creates a particular kind of stress. You're not together, but you can't completely separate. You see each other. You have to coordinate. You have to communicate about the children, about schedules, about the basic logistics of 2 people trying to live apart while still sharing responsibility for the people they created together. For some people, this becomes manageable over time, a new normal. A different kind of relationship, more practical than emotional. But for others, the proximity is painful, especially when the ex-partner moves forward in a visible way. And that's what was happening here. In the summer of 2017, his ex-girlfriend began dating someone new. Daniel Reyes, 30-2 years old. From Los Angeles, and within a relatively short period of time, he wasn't just her boyfriend in the abstract. He was becoming part of her home. He was in the apartment where Rodriguez Martinez's children lived. He was present during those moments of transition when the children moved between their mother's house and their father's custody time. For Rodriguez Martinez, this was a kind of repeated, visible loss. Every time he came to pick up his children or drop them off, he was encountering evidence that his ex-girlfriend's life had moved forward, that she had integrated another man into the space that he had once occupied. According to investigators in Orange County, he was not handling it well. They determined that Rodriguez Martinez had been jealous, not casually jealous. Not the kind of thing you feel and then process and move through. There was evidence that this jealousy had become a focus, a preoccupation, something that was shaping how he moved through the world. Neighbors who knew him described him as a caring father, someone who showed up for his children, someone who seemed invested in their lives and their well-being. But underneath that surface, something else was happening. He was noticing things. He was watching. He was paying attention to when Daniel Reyes was around. How often he was in the apartment, what his relationship with the children looked like. Research on jealous behavior shows that it often escalates in stages. It begins as an emotional response, a feeling of loss or displacement. But then it can transform into something else. Information gathering, monitoring, surveillance. When someone moves from simply feeling jealous to actively watching and tracking, it indicates that their focus has narrowed, that they're building a narrative in their mind about the threat. By October, things had shifted. The jealousy wasn't just something he was feeling anymore. It was something he was doing something about. According to the confession that his co-defendant, Aiden Zapitleva, would eventually provide a confession that didn't emerge until 2023. 6 years after the night in question, the two men had been planning something. Not some abstract idea of violence, something specific. Something that required a particular set of circumstances. They knew that Daniel Reyes was spending time at the apartment. They knew that he might be vulnerable at certain moments. And they knew that to do what they were planning, they would need access to the location. They would need to be nearby. And they would need the ex-girlfriend to believe that they were somewhere else. October 17th, 2017 was when that opportunity aligned. Rodriguez Martinez showed up at the apartment that evening, like he had many times before. He was there to watch his children while their mother worked. It was normal. It was the kind of thing that she would expect without hesitation. He was the father. He was responsible. Why would she question it? But this Chimmy, when he arrived, he brought an Aiden Zapitleva with him. Another pair of hands to help. Another person to keep the children occupied while he did whatever it was that he needed to do. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would raise alarm. The children's mother left for work. She trusted them. Why wouldn't she? But then something happened that revealed the true nature of what was taking place. The two men didn't actually leave when they were supposed to. They remained near the apartment building. They waited in the darkness outside. And according to Zapatleva's later confession, they were there for hours, surveilling, watching, waiting for the right moment. At some point that evening, the ex-girlfriend called. She wanted to know where they were. Maybe she was checking in. Maybe she was wondering if they needed anything. Maybe it was just a routine question. But she asked them where they were, and she needed them to tell her they were gone, so they lied. One of them, Zapatleva, would later say it was a deliberate deception, told her that they had already left the area. Hours ago, they were long gone. There was nothing to worry about. Everything was fine. It's a small thing, a phone call, a lie about location. But it's also a profound thing. It's the moment when a person uses your trust in them to manipulate your perception of danger. It's the moment when someone you thought was looking out for you is actually using your assumptions against you. Because he knew she would believe him. He knew that after years of co-parenting, after years of showing up, after years of being reliable, she would accept what he was telling her without verification. She would believe that it was safe to let Daniel Reyes exist in her home without being concerned about what was happening outside. In that moment, the entire setup of the evening was complete. The trap was set. The ex-girlfriend had been lied to in a way that made her let her guard down. And Daniel Reyes was inside an apartment, unaware that two men were positioned outside, waiting. The co-defendants' later testimony about these hours is crucial because it shows something important. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't two men who happened to encounter someone and a fight broke out. These were two men who had positioned themselves deliberately, who had decided in advance what they were going to do, who were willing to use the trust that had been built over years to set the stage for what would happen next. All of this, the surveillance, the waiting, the deliberate lie, told to someone who trusted him, was the infrastructure of what was about to unfold. And Daniel Reyes, inside that apartment, had no idea any of it was happening. Hours had passed. The apartment was dark. The children slept somewhere inside, unaware of what was being decided in the hours outside their walls. Daniel Reyes had arrived sometime that evening. He was staying over. He was part of this life now. He was the man that the children's mother was building something with. From inside the apartment, it felt safe, normal. The kind of progression that happens when a relationship is moving toward something more permanent. But outside, in the darkness, two men were still waiting. Reyes didn't know they were there. He had no reason to suspect that the people who had said they were leaving hours ago were actually still positioned in the shadows. He had no reason to believe that the reassurance he'd received that everything was fine, that no one was around, was actually a lie, told to make him feel exactly as he felt now. Safe. Early morning on October 19th, 2017, he left the apartment. The exact sequence of what happened next would be pieced together from witness accounts, from the investigations that followed, from the confession that one of the men would eventually provide. But the basic outline was simple, brutal in its simplicity. Two men were waiting at the intersection of Santa Ana Street and Helena Street, 2 blocks from where he'd been sleeping. When Reyes appeared, when he stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, with no idea what was about to happen, they moved toward him. There was nowhere for him to go. There was no moment of warning where he could have changed his decision about that morning. He was simply there, and they were simply there, and the thing that had been planned for hours crystallized in an instant. He was stabbed multiple times. 10 times. According to the confession that would come later. 10 separate acts of violence. each one designed to end the thing that was happening. It wasn't a fight where the balance was unclear. It wasn't an altercation where two people were evenly matched. It was an assault by two men against one, and there was nothing about it that left room for a different outcome. And in that moment, in what witnesses would describe as his final attempt to appeal to whatever humanity his attackers might possess, he said something. He invoked the one thing that he probably thought might matter. The only leverage he had in a moment where he was completely powerless. "Please don't," he said. "I have children." It was a statement of his own humanity. A reminder that his death would cascade into other deaths, not physical deaths, but the kinds of deaths that happen to people when the person they depend on is suddenly gone. His own children, somewhere in their own lives, would lose their father. His ex-partner, the mother of those children, would lose him. His own mother, somewhere, would lose her son, but it didn't matter. The violence didn't stop because he reminded them of his dependence. The violence didn't pause because he invoked mortality and consequence. The violence continued until there was nothing left to continue toward. By the time police arrived in response to calls about a fight at that intersection, by the time officers made their way to Santa Ana and Helena, there was a man on the ground bleeding from multiple wounds. There was evidence of an assault. There were witnesses who had seen two men running from the scene. And there was a realization that this wasn't a fight. This was a murder. Daniel Reyes was pronounced dead at the scene. What followed was the machinery of investigation. Photographs were taken. Witnesses were interviewed. The location was documented. Police began to canvass the neighborhood, searching for information about who these two men were, where they'd gone, what had motivated them to do this. They learned quickly about the co-parenting relationship, about the ex-girlfriend, about the jealousy, about the man who had used his role as a father to position himself near the location where this would happen. And they eventually determined that this hadn't been random. This hadn't been a chance encounter between strangers that escalated into tragedy. This had been planned, deliberate, intentional. One of the attackers was arrested 2 days later, without incident. He seemed to understand that running wasn't an option for him. Or perhaps he understood something else, that in the moment of violence, they had made different choices about what to do next. But Humberto Rodriguez Martinez, the one who had set the entire thing in motion, who had positioned himself as the trusted co-parent, who had orchestrated the lie that made Daniel Reyes feel safe, who had used the infrastructure of his own fatherhood as cover for murder, that man did run. Within days, his vehicle was found abandoned in San Diego, near the border. And then he was simply gone. Within hours of Daniel Reyes's body being discovered, the investigation deepened. Homicide detectives from the Anaheim Police Department documented the scene and took statements from witnesses who had seen two men running away and heard the commotion that led to the 911 calls. They traced the connections back to the nearby apartment and to the family living there. On October 21st, 2017, just 2 days after the murder, Aiden Zapitleva was arrested in Anaheim and held on a 7-figure bail. He had been there, he had been involved, and now he would face consequences. For Humberto Rodriguez Martinez, the story moved in another direction. His abandoned car in San Diego suggested what investigators feared. He had likely crossed the border. What began as a local homicide case had become something more complicated, a case that depended on time, coordination, and to countries willing to cooperate. For years, the file remained open. Aiden Zapitleva stayed in custody, eventually in prison. Humberto Rodriguez Martinez existed as a record, a warrant, a name, a face in databases. A person who had disappeared into another country and somehow managed to stay disappeared. In 2023, something shifted. Zapitleva decided to tell the full story. Not the bare minimum to avoid trial. Not a vague acknowledgement of involvement. A detailed account of that night, the hours of surveillance. The deliberate deception of the ex-girlfriend, the 10 stab wounds, the final words of the man they had killed. In exchange, he pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. Why he waited 6 years to provide this account has never been publicly explained. Whether it was negotiation, fear, or some internal change, that part of the story remains unclear. But with that plea, investigators finally had a complete narrative from someone who had been there. Even then, Rodriguez Martinez remained absent. He had spent years under a warrant, knowing that at some point, someone might come looking. Years of living in Mexico, his exact location unknown, his circumstances unreported. What does it mean to live with that kind of weight? To know that there is a family still grieving, still dealing with the fallout. While you live in a different country, under a different routine. In 2024, the long stalemate ended. Mexican authorities, working with United States agencies, located him. How they found him hasn't been disclosed, whether it was a tip, a stop, a database match, or some other lead. But once he was located, the extradition process began. On December 4th, 2025, he was extradited to the United States and taken into custody at Los Angeles International Airport. For the first time since that October night in 2017, he was back in the same legal system he'd fled. Days later, on January 6th, 2026, he appeared in Orange County Superior Court. He was arraigned on a charge of murder with special circumstance, allegations of lying in wait, and personal use of a knife. He entered a plea of not guilty and was remanded without bail. Because he is a Mexican citizen who was unlawfully in the United States at the time of the murder. He's also held under an immigration custody hold. He cannot simply bond out and go home. The case is now in pretrial status. Discovery is underway. Defense teams and prosecutors are preparing. Eventually, a jury will hear what happened, piece by piece, and decide whether the evidence supports the charges that have been filed. So where does this leave us? On paper, it's straightforward. One man, Aiden Zapitleva, pleaded guilty and accepted 15 years to life. Another man, Humberto Rodriguez Martinez, was brought back after years as a fugitive and now faces the possibility of life without parole. If a jury convicts him on the special circumstance murder charge, that is the legal resolution. Clear, defined, moving forward on a timeline that the system controls. But underneath that machinery is a different kind of question. A psychological one, a moral one, a question that no verdict will ever fully answer. Humberto Rodriguez Martinez spent years on the run. Years knowing there was a warrant with his name on it. Years knowing that what had happened on that street corner in Anaheim was not going to disappear. During those years, he was somewhere in Mexico. We don't know where. We don't know how he was living. We don't know if he was alone or surrounded by people who knew his story. We don't know if he lived in constant fear of being recognized or if he managed to convince himself that the distance made him safe. We don't know whether he was in contact with his children or whether his absence became a silence they were forced to grow around. What we do know is that he made the choice to flee rather than turn himself in. He crossed a border and tried to put another country between himself and what had happened. His co-defendant made a different choice. Zapit Leva didn't run. He was arrested within days and stayed in custody. He eventually stood in court, admitted what he had done, and accepted a sentence that may keep him in prison for the rest of his life. Why the difference? Why did one man decide to run while the other stayed? Was it because Rodriguez Martinez understood that his role was larger? That he had orchestrated the access, the surveillance, the deception? Was it because he had more connections, more ability to cross a border and disappear? Or was it something else? Fear, denial, a belief that time and distance could somehow dilute what had happened? We may never know. Unless he chooses to speak openly about those years, that part of the story will remain locked inside the person who lived it. What can be said is this: eventually, the system did what it was designed to do. A man accused of planning and carrying out a murder was located, extradited, and brought back to face charges. Law enforcement connected the threads across years and borders and pulled him back into the jurisdiction where the crime was committed. But a trial, even a thorough one, only answers certain kinds of questions. It will determine guilt or innocence. It will weigh evidence. It will decide whether the special circumstance, allegation of lying in wait is proven, whether the knife enhancement is established, whether he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It will not tell us what it felt like to live those years looking over his shoulder. It will not tell us what he thought about, or whether he regretted anything, or whether he ever allowed himself to imagine a different outcome. It will not tell us whether he believes his own story, or whether he has spent years trying not to think about what happened on that dark corner in Anaheim. And that distinction matters, because somewhere in that city, a woman is living with the knowledge of what her ex-partner was capable of, what he had been planning while she trusted him with her children, what he designed using the access that co-parenting had given him. She carries a kind of knowledge she never asked for and cannot put down. Somewhere, Daniel Reyes' children are growing up without their father. Their mother is raising them with the reality of how and why he was taken from them. That loss doesn't change depending on which side of a border the accused spent his years on. And Rodriguez Martinez's own children are growing up knowing that their father is accused of a terrible thing, that he fled rather than face it, that he disappeared from their lives and was brought back by law enforcement from another country. Whatever their relationship with him once was, whatever they believed about him, has been reshaped by the fact that his name is now tied to a murder case. Those are the human costs. Those don't change with the verdict. So when we ask, what years of fugitive status mean, when we wonder whether running from justice is the same as running from guilt, when we sit with the questions that a trial will not answer, we're not asking something abstract. We're asking what it means to live with the weight of what you've done. What distance costs, what running leaves behind, and whether, in the end, any amount of time or distance is enough to escape the thing you've set in motion. That question will sit with us long after the trial ends, long after a verdict is rendered, long after a sentence is imposed. Because some mysteries don't have legal answers,